All right, hello, y'all. Welcome back. Okay, I kind of last minute had to change the syllabus, so we're gonna shift from civil rights, and we're gonna sort of talk about the collapse of democracy, or the middle ground state, or what they call competitive authoritarianism. Okay, so early on in sort of political science theory, there was a really strong tendency to think that middling states were just inevitably on the path toward democracy, right? Like they were transitioning toward democracy eventually, and would get there with support, that sort of thing, right? But this was a really rosy way to sort of look at the world, and a lot of this came from Francis Fukuyama, who was a Stanford professor at university. I think he still is. Um, Wrote a book called "The End of History," right? And it was just the idea that after the wall fell, and the bipolar system that was the United States versus the Soviet Union, or sort of capitalism versus communism, whatever you might call it, um, that once the wall fell, the world would inevitably transition toward capitalist democratic systems, right? At the end of history, there's no more argument about what the state should look like. And for about 10 years or so, Fukuyama looked like he might have a point, but that has just completely collapsed in sort of the contemporary era. And Fukuyama looks a little bit foolish, honestly. And again, it's this rosy picture that like all states were going to transition toward, human rights and democracy and capitalism, and the tripartite assumption of man, I wish we could have read him too. Yeah, it'll come to me. But the idea that democratic governance and trade and human rights sort of thing, Immanuel Kant, would inevitably lead towards less war, all of these sorts of rosy ideas about where we were going. But we were wrong, right? African nations sort of took a little bit of a transition towards democracy, um, post colonialism, but things aren't going well there for the most part, right? Post-communist nations looked like they were turning toward democracy, right? After the fall of the wall, when the USSR fractured into around 20 states or so, they all implemented democratic norms and these sorts of things, but we've seen that those haven't gone great either, right? In places like Hungary, um, in places like Ukraine, let's be honest, they've had real troubles with their democracy over the last 20 years. So it's become a problem area as well. Russia, after the fall of the wall, looked like they were going to transition towards democracy under Khrushchev. But we've seen some pretty serious backsliding under the Putin administration, right? A dictatorship almost. Yes, they hold elections, but we all know they're bullshit, right? And then Peru under Fujimori is another really great example. It looked like it was going to be a shining star, as did Venezuela during the 1990s. They were rich. Their standard of living was improving dramatically. Their electoral functions were working pretty well for, especially related to the region, right? South America and Central America. But both those countries saw severe sort of turns toward dictatorship, but really it was turns toward what we're going to talk about, competitive authoritarianism, where yes, elections still existed, but it was not really in any way truly democratic, and the leaders of the state used their power to manipulate elections and things of this sort. And then under Chavez, things were rosy for a couple of years and he was winning elections. But as things started to turn, and their oil industry started to collapse, and then Maduro came in, I mean, nobody can say that's a democratic nation at this point. So, just to sort of hammer the point home, this rosy picture of sort of the 70s through 2000-ish was maybe a little bit infantile, honestly. Okay, so um, they also just sort of point out that like it's important to think about the typology, right, of what we call a state in political science or economics. Yes, there are democracies, and yes, there are autocracies, but there are many different varieties of each. And as uh, what's this guy's name? Levitsky and Way say. By the way, I think they're at like Yale, and Way is at a big college in Europe. But they're saying like we also need to typify the middle ground states, right? And we need to understand more about how they operate, what their differences are, what their similarities are, so that we maybe can push them toward democracy in the future, right? Okay. Section 2, defining competitive authoritarianism. This was starting to pop up all over the place around the turn of the millennium, I guess, the 2000s. And so there were all kinds of different ways that you could refer to these middle ground states, right? And some thought they were like transitioning democracies, right, like we talked about. But there were also sort of a bunch of different terminology coming around, like illiberal democracies or partly free states, according to Polity, or um, man, there's a whole bunch. But we've sort of almost come to this idea that this is the terminology we're going to use now, competitive authoritarianism, um, over about 20 years, right? And they offer a definition here, and I don't usually read from the book very often, but definitions are very important. Okay, it is a competitive authoritarian state is a state with formal democratic institutions that are widely viewed as the principal means of obtaining and exercising political authority, right? They still have states, elections, they still have institutions. However, incumbents violate those rules so often and to such an extent that the regime fails to meet conventional minimum standards for democracy, right? And so, I guess we should have just take a minute to say, why would a state want to participate in this? Like, if you want to be a dictator or an authoritarian or a strongman, whatever you might call it, why would you still keep elections around and institutions around? And there's a couple of answers. One, both of them are about pressure, right? Domestic pressure. Um, we know from science and statistics and stuff that um, authoritarian states can have a lot of violence on both sides. Either the violence of the of the citizens lashing out against the state because they don't have freedoms, right? Basic human freedoms, but also the state lashing out against the citizens to repress them, right? And this can also bring, to the other point, international pressure, right? For the longest time, the United States and the West basically set the rules for the international game, right? And if you did not follow those rules, you did not have access to loans from the IMF or the World Bank. You would be sort of snubbed in the UN. You wouldn't be allowed to participate in a lot of these like rule-making institutions that exist at the higher level, like the supranational level. Excuse me. Um, and so there was pressure for states to sort of follow the rules. So, right. So, in that sense, a leader who, even if they wanted to be a dictator, which let's be real, I think probably most leaders do, um, they have to, in a sense, signal legitimacy to not only their domestic audience, their citizens, but also to the international arena. And this has been crumbling a little bit, right? As China and institutions like the BRICS, right? BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are sort of legitimizing this middle ground or even authoritarianism by providing alternative international organizations and development money through like the Asian Infrastructure Bank and things like that, right? Okay. What is the minimum criteria for a democracy according to the Lucan and Way, Levitsky and Way, excuse me? Okay, they say there are 4 rules that you have to meet at least most of the time to be considered a legitimate democracy, right? Number 1, the executive, which is either your president or your prime minister or whatever it might be, and the legislature are chosen through elections that are open, free, and fair, right? Number two, virtually all adults have the right to vote, right? And they make exceptions for like, felon stuff. But, if you're excluding a group because of their race or ethnicity or gender or something like that, like you don't qualify as a democracy under modern rules. Number three, political rights and civil liberties, including freedom of press, freedom of association, and freedom to criticize government without reprisal, are broadly protected, right? So we would sort of think of this as our First Amendment rights in America, right? The right to criticize your government, the right to an open and free press, the right to associate as you will, as long as you are not a criminal organization, um, and the state does not bring reprisal against you for those actions, right? Okay. And then finally, elected authorities possess real authority to govern in that they are not subject to tutelary control of the military or clerical leaders. And this is where a state like Iran would fall out of the democracy list, right? Yes, sure, they have elections. They, they don't really allow for freedom of the press or whatever. But what really disqualifies them is that the presidential elections are basically run by the the Muslim Shia clerical leaders in Iran, right? Like you can't even run for president unless you pass their test, right? And so it's not real democracy. Like they're choosing who you get to vote for, and that is a very narrow subset, right? Okay. They're also careful, right? Levitsky and Way are careful, and they say, like, you know, we understand that, like, sometimes a leader gets elected and breaks the rules. Um, but as long as it's not habitual, right, and the institutions hold and things sort of go back to normal and hit those four qualifications, that's still a democracy, right? Uh, the trouble is that when, like, this is just a behavioral pattern, right, by the incumbent government. And that's when you shift toward competitive authoritarianism. And they basically say, like, it comes down to whether there exists some actual opposition, right? Opposition is a good thing, despite what party you love. Opposition strengthens us, and a fair chance at overturning the government at some point, right? Like, those two things are important. And this is why states like Japan, who was ruled under the LDP for, oh man, 70-ish years, right? From the Marshall Plan post World War II all the way up to like the mid 2000s, the same party won every election. And there are questions about whether that's a true democracy, right? And so, in a lot of data sets, Japan does not qualify during that time. The same can be said of Mexico under the PRI, the Revolutionary Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI. They won every election for like 60 years, and there was no turnover of government. So who's to say they would have turned over government, right? And so, in that sense, they often don't qualify in many of the data sets either during that PRI period. Okay, they say, although elections are regularly held and are generally free of massive fraud, right? Incumbents routinely abuse state resources. They deny their opposition adequate media coverage. They harass their opposition candidates and supporters. And in some case, they will tinker with electoral results, right? All right. Section three, the four arenas of democratic contestation, right? So there are basically, and this is the stuff I want to really focus on these readings, is how do we see and push back about that kind of behavior, right? Like where are the mechanisms by which you can push back, even despite this competitive authoritarianism and sort of incumbent manipulation, right? And they say there are four areas. The first is electoral, right? Yes, there might be problems with the election, but they still have to run, and there might often be a chance to win them if you play the game right as an opposition member. These elections tend to be rife with sort of abuses of power by the incumbent party, but the opposition can win sometimes, right? Uh, the state has a lot of power, but one of the ironies of authoritarianism and this sort of thing is that sometimes the states are unable to recognize their own weaknesses for a multitude of reasons, right? Because they're suppressing free media, or maybe they're just telling media, like, don't publish touchy stuff, right? Or there will be issues, right? Um, let's see. Oh, they also, like, if they get bad news from inside their government, say, right? Sometimes they'll just fire those people and say, like, I don't even want real data, because then the citizens can see how bad things are getting. And and so in this sense, you start to erode your own sense of reality as the leader in one of these states, because you're basically telling everybody, just cover your eyes and let's make everything sound rosy. And the more you do that, the more it erodes. And when the citizens can't, like, freely tell you, like, I'm pissed off about this, right? Then maybe the bubble bursts and things just, like, instantly avalanche, like what happened when the wall fell under communism, right? Okay. Yeah, I covered all that. Oh, and then the final point is, like, if you do say you're in that situation and you did not recognize you were going to lose this election, even though things are tilted toward your party. Um, if you try to go so far as to just, like, nullify the results or just clear fakery, right? That can cause civil war. It can cause people to try to assassinate you, right? There are consequences for those sorts of things. And it can also get you sort of pariah status on the international stage if you're not careful, though that's breaking down a little. All right. What is the second arena by which opposition can fight back? This is the legislature, right? So again, they tend to be tilted toward the incumbent, right? But it can be a platform for defiance, for bringing attention, for shifting public opinion, for creating name creation, for having been, like, I don't know, sort of lionized for being willing to stand up and say something, right? So this can be an important platform. The third, the judicial arena. This can be problematic too, right? Because again, the executive is pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable democratic behavior. So often you see sort of judgeships stuffed with political ideologues. You see, in the U.S. they would call it like a ethics violation, right? Or they'll try to impeach, right? That sort of thing. The judges who don't agree with your side, right? And then often they'll harass them. There can also, we're finding that there can be high levels of bribery in these sorts of societies where, like, you rule the way I want, you'll get something out of it, right? This quid pro quo behavior. However, if you had at one point democracy or an opposition party in charge, there will inevitably be some opposition members in the judiciary, and you're probably not going to be able to get rid of every one of them, right? And so, in that sense, judges who sort of refuse to bow or take bribes or whatever, right? They're sort of above it, and they won't be pushed out, right? They can also become lionized in a society, um, and usually there is, even if citizens are willing to sort of be like, I'll look the other way for my political party. There's something about judiciaries that are powerful where most citizens just think, like, there should be judicial independence and fairness, right? And so it's a little harder sometimes when a judge comes out and says these things than it is, say, like an opposition legislative member or the media, right? Like, generally, this is the most highly regarded branch of government in your society, right? So this can be a powerful mechanism for opposition. Okay, and then the fourth is media, the fourth arena by which you can, as an opposition member, push back. Uh, and they say that, like, this is subtle, right? Because we know that there are methods by which incumbent parties um, use the media or take control of the media, right? Or harass media members, okay? And they can do this through a bunch of different ways, right? Again, bribery tends to be pretty high in these places where they'll just pay off editors, generally editors, right? Because they're at the top level and they say what gets published and what doesn't, but sometimes journalists, that sort of thing. There tends to be selective allocation of state advertising. So the incumbent party will pass a bill saying, we have $10 million for, pro civics advertising, right? And then it just becomes like pro incumbent party advertising in those newspapers and media outlets that actually agree with your side, right? So it kind of touches on bribery. Manipulation of debts and taxes owned by media outlets, or some states even will shift some public funds toward free and fair government, right? Think of like the BBC in England, even though there are some issues there, right? Um, but they'll start to manipulate those, right? They'll also try to foment conflict among stockholders and say, like, I'll go after your other assets if you don't play ball. Um, yeah, this can be troubling too. Or again, bribery, right? We'll give you access to government contracts and stuff if you quit publishing opposition media, right? Let's see. Oh, in Russia under Putin, they would just like arrest them, right? Media leaders, big oil tycoons who spoke out against the state, like they'll just throw them in the gulag, right? And that happens too. Let's see. Oh, and they'll start changing some of the laws of the state and like calling man skeptical or opposition op-eds or journalism or whatever you might call it. They'll start calling it like terrorism, right? Or you're degrading the state, so it's treason and these sorts of things, which is not free media, right? Okay. I wanted to add a couple because these are a couple that we are starting to see in the West and maybe in the US. And one is lawfare, right? Like drumming up all of these different ways to sue these people who annoy you. So it costs them money, time, stress, family, these sorts of things, right? Even if your case is spurious, which we've seen a lot of out of the Trump administration. Government oversight of secrets. And so there are laws on the books, even in the United States, that say, like, if these are touchy government secrets, you have to pass it through the government for check before you can publish, right? And this was a big fight under the Vietnam Papers. I forget what they were called. But this was a big fight with like the New York Times. And so, like, as they start to ratchet up what counts as a government secret or touchy or whatever, the more oversight they have over what gets published in your society. And then finally, kind of a big one in the U.S., given how much money there is in the United States, right, is sort of outright purchases of media outlets by extremely rich people with ideology on one side or the other, right? And this is starting to become troubling, especially some of the stuff we heard about the Washington Post cutting out a huge chunk of their staff and these sorts of things under Jeff Bezos. And this goes both ways, but yeah, this is sort of troubling, right? Okay, section 4: inherent tensions. You know what? We talked about legitimacy, domestic and international. So there are tensions there about how far you can go with your autocracy because of these domestic and international expectations of what are the rules by which we have to play. And then I also wanted to point out they say succession is not democratization, right? You have to still, even if an opposition party takes over, they have to actually play by those four above rules for it to actually count as a democracy. You can still just bounce back and forth between authoritarianism or back and forth between competitive authoritarianism. And so we have to be skeptical and thoughtful and careful about just declaring that everything's fixed and we're in a democracy now, right? Okay. Section 5: paths to competitive authoritarianism. There are a handful of different ways to get to competitive authoritarianism, right? This isn't always just a transitioning state, and it's not always just a collapsing democracy, right? There are different facets by which this happens. The first they talk about is the decay of a full blown authoritarian regime, right? And generally, what happens is some combination of domestic and international pressure sort of force a shift toward democracy, not necessarily full democracy, right? And they say, due to the weakness of opposition movements, transitions fell short of democracy. And incumbents proved adept at manipulating or selectively adhering to the new democratic rules, right? And this can be difficult for authoritarian states because they don't have any of those cultural or institutional or civic um, patterns or behaviors or expectations that often exist when you move from democracy towards competitive authoritarianism, where people go, oh, I feel the degradation of my rights and I see where like democracy is failing, right? If you come from a tyrannical state, any improvement probably feels better, right? But it's also really easy to manipulate those states because they don't have a strong civil society. They don't have expectations or beliefs about what institutions should look like. Any bit of fairness is probably better than what it used to be, even if it's not like there, right? And so this can be an interesting case. And they point out that a lot of sub Saharan Africa, after their post colonial transition toward democracy, or after their sort of dictatorships in many of these states, uh, they tried to transition towards democracy, but they still are nowhere close in many cases, right? Okay. Number two, the collapse of a competitive authoritarian regime, followed by a new competitive authoritarian regime, right? And they say here, although the absence of democratic traditions and weak civil societies created opportunities for elected governments to rule autocratically, these governments lacked the capacity to consolidate authoritarian rule, right? And so, like, the leaders moved from an authoritarian state, but the opposition somehow won, but they remained there and they weren't able to lock down a tyranny, right? But they also were not able to transition fully, or maybe they didn't want to transition fully to a democracy, right? And here, their sort of grouping of examples is post-communist states, right? The 19 or 20 sort of satellite states that fell off the Soviet Union. And I would point to some of the stands, especially like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. They sort of seem to have a rotating competitive authoritarian system, sometimes shifting towards like full dictatorship, but never really going and kind of bouncing back to a middle. All right. Number three is democratic decay, right? So these are deep and often long-standing political and economic crises create conditions under which freely elected governments decided to undermine democratic institutions, either via presidential self-coup. This is what we call an autogolpe under sort of the Latin American literature, or through selective incremental abuses, but lacked the will or capacity to eliminate them entirely. So again, this would be Fujimori, this would be Hugo Chavez, this would be Viktor Orban in Hungary, and then probably Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Iran, right? And then like Levitsky and Way, who wrote this piece, are very loud right now about like this is what is happening in the United States as well. So um, we'll probably put a question on the exam about that. Okay. Um, why did the world not move toward, the end of history, right, under Fukuyama's regime? Um, Transition is really difficult, right? Full democracy is hard and messy, and you need a lot of state resources to strengthen the institutions. You need a lot of trust from your citizens and your politicians. You need these unspoken rules of the game where you don't break the rules even if you could, right? Oftentimes, if you're in a dictatorship like we talked about, civil society just doesn't exist. And so it's really hard to get opposition groups together or civil society groups or these sorts of things, right? We know from the work of people like Robert Putnam from Harvard that civil society can be very important in sort of providing the foundation for a democracy and a true oppositional democracy where there's respectful disagreement, right? Oftentimes, dictatorships don't have any judicial strength, right? Like they were completely manipulated under the former regime. And so citizens don't know what to expect. Institutions aren't strong and don't have much history. That can make transition very difficult as well. And often what happens is that the judiciary stays packed with the former dictatorship's judges, right? And so that can be a huge boundary. It can be a huge blockage to democratic transition. See, sometimes there's mixed opinions among citizens, right? Think about, even in Western democracies, you have a segment that are like communist on the very far left. You have a segment that are fascist or sort of nationalist on the far right. Um, but these things tend to be even bigger in former dictatorships, right? Where people go to the extremes or where you've been sort of indoctrinated your entire life by the state to think that fascism or tyranny or whatever it might be, communism, are the answer to all of life's ills, right? And so this can be very difficult to overcome. And then finally, there can be a lack of human capital, like education. Think about a lot of African states. Think about a lot of, well, the post-communist states were, communism was kind of focused on education, but some of the other places where they don't have a tax base, there's a lot of poverty. They might not even have institutions for education where you can teach your citizens, like, here are civic responsibilities, here are the way the state should work, etc. Um, okay, final little unit here. Why do we not slide into complete authoritarianism, right? And so they just give sort of a closing discussion on this about um, democracy and the West used to reward states for shifting toward democracy. But as the sort of post World War II regime completely collapses, right? NATO's in trouble, we've got war in Ukraine, we've got war in Israel, we've got war in Eastern Africa. These things are starting to collapse, and we also have more competition from states like China, India, these sorts, right? And so the mechanism of rewarding states that follow good human rights and democracy, etc., is crumbling, especially as many democracies themselves slide toward competitive authoritarianism, right? And so this has opened up uh, more legitimacy for authoritarian and semi authoritarian states. Okay. Um, the second piece is a lot of these we've talked about don't have a strong economy, right? And so, in a weird sense, if you don't have the state resources to repress your society, you kind of have to let them have some semblance of elections, right? And so, this seems to be some of the problems with like sub-Saharan Africa. This touches on what we call the minimum winning coalition research from a guy named Bruce Buenanamesquita from NYU, who also worked with like the CIA and the FBI. He's a huge game theorist, right? But he talks about in democracies, your minimum winning coalition is like 50% of the population because you got to win a vote or whatever. But in a dictatorship, it's very small. Your selectorate is tiny, and it might be the corporate overlords or the military leaders or these sorts of things that you have to keep happy. And so it's interesting, the more you shift towards authoritarianism, the smaller your selectorate becomes, right? Your minimum winning coalition. The more you shift towards democracy, the bigger it comes. But that means in the middle, there's some jiggery-pokery going on, right? Where it's not full elections and it's not full repression. So interesting stuff. I would say that the exceptions include the resource curse block, right? So this is why much of the Middle East has not transitioned toward democracy, even though they do have resources, right? They can use those resources to just pay off their citizens. They don't have to keep citizens happy to collect taxes to keep the state running. And so you get the resource curse. All right, that was a long one, but I hope you enjoyed it. I think this is fascinating stuff, right? And we have more to come. So it's good to learn sort of how to push back against it, no matter where you are on Earth, because democracy just seems to be the best to me at the moment. So, okay, have a wonderful day, and I'll get the next one up ASAP.